Hey everyone. So today we're talking about that special connection between listening and emotion. Reading the Kendrick article really makes this pretty clear as well, but just going to give you some additional tips to think about how it's all connected and what it all means, man. So, first we'll talk a little bit about listening. So, listening is a process, as you've learned so far. So that process includes receiving, attending, understanding, responding, and recalling. It is a learned behavior from a particular and generalized others. And just because you can hear, as you've seen, doesn't mean that you're capable of listening. And listening is actually defined as a primary skill because it's the first communication skill we develop, and it's the most commonly used skill in our adult life. So it's really important to be a good listener and to learn how to be a good listener. As we've talked about in other sections so far, like no one is born as a great communicator. No one's born as a great listener. Maybe you are just a better listener than others by traits. You like to listen to people, you don't like to talk as much. There's a variety of things that influence us. Again, learned behavior. Maybe you had good listeners that came before you. My parents are terrible listeners. When it comes to communication, listening is one of my weakest skills, but one that I'm always seeking to develop. And teaching this lesson over and over again throughout my adult life is really helping me to become a better listener because it reminds me of all those things I want to remember to be a better listener. So it's a learned behavior. The different functions we've got to discern, to comprehend, to appreciate, to analyze. You don't just use one of these in most scenarios. You're usually using some kind of combination of them. Same with the styles, people oriented, time oriented, action oriented, and content oriented. It really just depends on the situation. So a lot of listening is context dependent. So you'll use, like at work, I might use all four styles in one day, just depending on who I'm talking to. It's like the context. If you're listening to your friend tell you about a bad day, at that point, you're being a people oriented listener and you're listening to support or even appreciate. I mean, I love to listen to appreciate. I just like listening to stories. So I'm like, listening to appreciate is my favorite way to listen, but it's not what I don't have the luxury of being able to do that all the time. So, or think about if you're at work, your boss is giving you directions for a project you're working on. In that case, you're going to be an action oriented listener and you're going to be listening to comprehend. So just thinking about how all these things fit together. Like listening is really complex, right? It's got five different functions that could be taking place, four different styles you could be using. There's five ineffective listening styles that you should be avoiding at all costs so that you're not like stealing people's conversations and that sort of thing. But also, you can't you can turn it on, you can turn it off, but you should mostly have it turned on for most situations. And especially when we're talking about these I you and I thou relationships, this is going to be, you might be in some of the most difficult listening situations with people that are closest to you, because those are going to be the people that self-disclose to you, right? We've been talking about self-disclosure. In order for self-disclosure to be effective to you is for you to be able to receive it, attend to it, understand it, respond to it, and be able to recall it at a later date. I know that's one of my biggest pet peeves about my husband. I'll tell him about something, like a serious thing that happened in my life, and then later on I'll bring it up, like, days, weeks, years later, and he's just like, you never told me about that. I'm like, oh, I totally told you about it. So he can act like he's listening, but he really struggles with responding. So yes, it's a complex process, putting it into practice. And sometimes you feel uncomfortable, and like that's kind of where the emotion part comes into it, is balancing a feeling of being uncomfortable and try not to be distracted by that feeling so you can still be present in a listening situation. So it is really important to limit those distractions of being uncomfortable or the multitasking online. Did you guys see that part? That's dangerous. You got to be really careful. We're all slowly deteriorating our ability to maintain focus. And also, that's why emotional intelligence is important to listening, like knowing how you're feeling, knowing how others are feeling, and helping that guide how you might respond in a situation. Listening to analyze and listening to discern really are relating back to emotional intelligence as well. So, listening, and that's how it's connected to emotions. So, let's talk more about emotions, right? They're fundamental to interpersonal communication and meaning because it's really like that's how we express ourselves. Someone's like, how are you feeling? Like, I am feeling, what am I feeling? The Kendrick article actually gives us a great list of words, of feeling words and emotion words to use when our feelings are met and when our feelings aren't met on pages 9 and 10. And I was like, how many of us use that much of an emotional vocabulary? Like, there's 6 primary emotions. I would say most of the time I'm like, I'm happy, I'm grumpy, I'm tired, which isn't really an emotion. It's more of a cognitive state, but it affects my emotions, right? Um, Frustrated, right? But then you get this like big list. You're like, wow, there are lots of different ways to feel. So being more specific with the words that you choose when you're expressing yourself is even a sign of higher emotional intelligence. So emotions are important. They help us connect to one another. They're reactive. You know, we are triggered by outside events. Like rarely we're just like sitting at home feeling our feels. It's like usually you see a post, you read something, someone says something to you, right? Like you have a reaction and you are in control of that reaction. Or the emotionally intelligent person is in control of that reaction. So really thinking about like how you're feeling, where that feeling's coming from, avoiding blaming other people for your feelings. That's kind of where all of this emotional intelligence stuff and the nonviolent communication stuff is coming into play. We really need to like interpret how we're feeling. Like maybe like we feel it physiologically in the body. You're like, oh, why does my chest feel so heavy? Like what's happening inside of me? Is it anger? Is it fear? There's like a lot of different things that fall into the complex part of feeling emotions, expressing those emotions. One thing to feel it, it's another thing entirely to express it. So emotional intelligence, it's a 4-part process. Okay, so you might be better at this at some parts than you might be at others. That's where you should take your EI emotional intelligence quiz this week to see how you are with your own emotional intelligence. So I don't know if it's easier to see that or not, but people with high degrees of emotional intelligence usually possess these 4 skills: an acute understanding of their own emotions, the ability to empathize, an aptitude for constructively managing their own emotions. So not just like expressing every single thing that comes to mind, but managing them using reappraisal, using some emotional prevention techniques like encounter avoidance, encounter structuring, those sorts of things. So, but how do you know to do that if you haven't learned to do that? So that's kind of the purpose here. Like the textbook really gives a lot of great examples on different ways to handle and manage your emotions. And then finally, the 4th part of this definition is the capacity for applying emotional states in ways that create competent decision making, communication, and relationship problem solving. So this number 4, this 4th part of this is really like how emotional intelligence relates to listening. So being able to sit down and listen to someone, even if you don't agree with them, and to not put your opinion in there, not to give that advice that nobody asked for. It really, it takes patience, it takes practice, and it takes a lot of effort. So I encourage you to be practicing some of these skills as you're learning them with your family members, with your partners, with your friends, and reflect on your emotional intelligence and ways that you might increase it. We all have we all have room to grow. We might be strong in 1, 2, and 3, and might need more help with 4, right? It's complex. Everything's complex today. So the merging of the 2 things really is nonviolent communication. So we've got, this is a tool that is great for being able to honestly express your feelings and emotions without thinking about how it might affect someone else. It's a way to express them in an objective way. And then to be able to listen emphatically. So the 4-part process here for honestly expressing your feelings. Let's see if I can get out of the way. Hey, there I am. So that's observation, feeling, need, request. So if you remember, observation is just like stating what's happened that's like made you upset or like behaving in a way because your feelings aren't met, right? And then the feeling is you've got those great lists on pages 9 and 10 of feeling words when your needs are met, feeling words when your needs aren't met. Needs, again, like what need is being violated here? The needs are on page 11, and it's like an expansion of Maslow's hierarchy. So all this stuff, guys, it's always building on each other here. Then finally, a request. You're not making demands of other people. You're asking them, like, would you be willing to change your behavior in the future? They can still say no, right? That's no matter how good we get at using nonviolent communication, we can't force other people to use it with us. So this is why it's great. I get the opportunity to educate you folks on this, and you can share it with the folks in your lives that you interact with most, so you can practice it together. And then hopefully someday, after a little bit of practice, you'll be able to use this to more efficiently manage your own relationships, which is great. So the listening part of this, I feel like it's not focused on as much as like the expression part in the article, but it's still important to remember to avoid judgment. So even if someone's saying something that you don't agree with, it's not your business to judge it. Just you're listening to listen to someone. You're holding space for them to say whatever they want without them worrying about you judging them or for you giving them advice unless they explicitly ask for it. Also, use those back channel cues. That's like verbal and nonverbal ways of like nodding them, encouraging them along, like, yeah, oh yeah, like just short little phrases you can say. And then finally, summarizing to clarify. I have a physiological issue. I'm partially deaf. So like sometimes I just like grapple with the hearing part. So that's like going all the way back to like attending to. Sometimes I'm not able to attend to someone's message because of like my hearing issues. And I have to summarize to clarify a lot just to make sure I get what's going on. Sometimes I'm like, is this what you said? And they're like, no way. I'm like, glad I asked. Okay, it's always okay to ask. And summarizing can help you recall that later on, and it helps you respond. It gives them like, I'm hearing you say this. Is this correct? Little check-ins like that can show that you're listening. So an example of NVC in practice here, we've got our evaluation statement. Remember the jackal versus the giraffe. So like you could say you're a jerk using you language. More on that when we talk about verbal, nonverbal language in chapter 8 and 9 next week. And then we've got the NVC statement of this would be, when you said I was a fool at the meeting, that's the observation. That's like something that happened. It's objective. I felt annoyed. That's your feelings, right? When your needs aren't met. And would like some respect, or because you value respect. You've got a few different ways you could phrase this. And then you could say, would you tell me what's going on with you? Like maybe you, as you're listening to discern with someone else, you realize that they have a bit of an attitude towards you, or like, yeah, maybe it's nothing to do with you. Maybe you weren't being a fool in the meeting, but someone else has some other emotional challenge that they're going through and they're just kind of taking it on you. Sounds like they could use some NVC too. So are you going to use this with every single person in your life? No. But in those you, I, thou relationships that are really meaningful for you, this can be a really constructive way to express your emotions, and also for you to be able to support your partners and your friends when they're expressing things to you too. And feel free to share this. Once you practice it a couple times, it gets a lot easier. So yeah, let me know if you've got any questions. Have a great day.